the chat as it comes across. I don't think, I mean, as we get into this conversation, I think you'll learn more about me and but first of all, thank you to Central for the opportunity to share. This actually started, I think, about a year ago, August of 2021. And so it's been fun and a little bit overwhelming to see your face in different places. But so thank you to those who shall remain nameless to make this possible this afternoon. So I'm excited, a little nervous, I'll be honest, and praying that my Zoom works and my internet doesn't go wacko. So yeah, it should be fun.
It will be. Thank you so much, Melissa. Would you just start us off telling us briefly about some of the history of the church you serve, Grandview Baptist Church in Kansas City, Kansas?
Absolutely. Grandview was founded in 1910, so it is now 122 years old. The original structure was further into Kansas City, Kansas, and then in the late 1920s, early 30s, they describe it as the building was literally falling down around them. And so they had to decide what to do. And so they prayed and discerned, and they bought property at 24th and Grandview Boulevard in Kansas City, Kansas in the late 20s, early 30s, and they began to build. And so the first structure they built was their basement fellowship hall in the late 20s or 30s. And by 1932, it was completed. And actually, one of my members who's now passed away, she was 8 when they completed that structure. So there's little Dorothy. She's with Jesus now, but I got to pastor Dorothy for about 11 years. So that was exciting. So they were there. They secured ground, built their fellowship hall in completed 1932. And then over the next 80 years, continued with the structure, building it. But in 1977, they had a fire. The structure, someone broke in and had a candle and started a fire. And so in 1977, the sanctuary burnt, but they rebuilt in the same location. So they suffered a fire in 1977. Then of course, part of the conversation that led to today was in 2017, when I started pastoring. I actually started pastoring in 2010. I was called to be their pastor in 2010. And then in 2017, due to the change in numbers and commitments and financial responsibilities and structure issues, we began conversations to what to do next. And of course, that led to the sale of the building in 2018. And then we've moved over to First Baptist Church, Kansas City, Kansas. We've been there almost 4 years. We meet in their chapel, and then we also have uses of another room. So that's kind of their story. Also, of course, as it is with many churches' story, is the change in numbers over the decades. I think in 1985, when they did their 75th, there was probably about 100 folks out there in the picture. And then in 2010, probably about a third of the size of groups. So, and now currently our current worship numbers, attendance is about 15. So that kind of gives you an idea of the size of Grandview. So that's the brief history of Grandview Baptist, as much as I can remember. So
that's great. That really helps set the context for our conversation today. And you mentioned the kind of smaller numbers, and we know a lot of churches are facing that, and therefore a lot of churches, especially post-COVID, have this question about selling their church building. And so would you tell us a little bit about the process that Grandview used to come to that decision to sell the building?
It actually was probably a long time coming, as it is with several churches. But I remember specifically in 2017, in the spring of 2017, and I went to talk to our region staff for the American Baptist Churches of the Central Region and began to say, this is where we're at. And honestly, probably what led to the beginning of the conversation was a realization that we had a basement that needed to be redone. And as we all know, to redo any kind of structure, especially basements, can be very expensive. And so this really kind of gave way to a conversation then what should we do? Are we going to make the investment and fix our basement or do some structural repair? Or are we going to look at something different? And so the conversation started in 2017, the summer of 2017, and discerning, and we did it as a group. You know, one of the advantages of a smaller group is everyone has a voice, and everyone should have a voice. But one of the things we didn't have to face was a large number of people weighing in. Everyone had a voice, and we can make the decision collectively. And so through the process of talking with other people and really praying about lots of conversations, in the fall of 2017, we voted to sell the building. And so we also decided to stay together. We would rather stay together than stay together and move than keep the building. So it was kind of a process of how it came about, and prayed, and we really decided this was the best option. And so there was a church vote to do that, and it was a majority pass. And then we contacted a realtor, et cetera, and began the process. And then we also began to look about other opportunities of where we could gather. And so we thought about several churches in the Kansas City, Kansas area close to the building. And we connected with First Baptist Church of Kansas City, Kansas, which is, of course, not too far from Grandview. We reached out to them and had some conversations with their pastor, Bill Delphia, and really felt that this would be a good place for us to land. It'd still be in the neighborhood. And as it is with many churches, there's a long time relationship. And so fortunately, we'd had a long time relationship with First Baptist. And so we came to that decision based on a reality that we were facing. It was either going to stay together or decide to or let the building kind of take over and disband because we couldn't afford to keep the building. So it kind of came out of necessity, but also it was nice because we could sell it before we had to, if that makes sense. We weren't forced to sell, but we were able to be in a position where we could look at selling the building. And then I will tell you that we really prayed about what was going to be next for the building and for the structure. And so long story short, it actually was put on the market in May of 2018, which is kind of a shock to see a for sale sign in front of a church building, especially if it's the church building that you've been serving and that you love. That was hard to see that. But we've been working with a realtor, and unbeknownst to us, there was another group in Kansas City, Kansas that was looking for a permanent structure. And so they'd been thinking and praying. And so we were approached in June of 2018. I remember showing the pastors of this other church, Grandview, the building. And by October 1st, the building was sold, which is pretty impressive. And we're truly a God thing, especially where we were located. But I really believe that God was preparing this building for them. And the ministry has continued at that corner, not through Grandview itself, but through another ministry. So that was probably the greatest sense of relief we had, was that another church bought the building. And so the mission continued at 24th and Grandview. So that was huge. And that it was sold in such a short amount of time, which, I only attribute to the movement of the Spirit and God's plan. So that's how we got there. It was out of necessity, but also to be fiscally responsible and stay together. That's really what drove us.
Thank you. That's really helpful. In talking about that, you touched a couple times on some of the emotional pieces of this journey. The impact of seeing a for sale sign in front of the church, and then the relief of knowing another church has bought the building and the mission continues. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the emotional and spiritual journey that you personally, as the pastor of this church, but also the congregation collectively took throughout this process?
Sure. It was, I'll first show you what my congregation went through and then what I went through. And because often it was interwoven, right? Like they were having their emotions. I was having my emotions, my experiences. But I think one of the things that we really experienced was, or that they experienced, was shock, right? Not a bad shock, but shock that they'd gotten to this point, because a lot of them had been at Grandview for 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And so had been at the building. So they never thought they would see this day, the day of which, the building would have to be sold for financial reasons. And so I think that, I think what they went through was trying to process all that had happened, and also a period of grief, right? Because as we know, a church building isn't just a structure, it's a lot of memories. It's a lot of memories. They married there, they buried there, their children were in Sunday school, their children were in vacation Bible school, there was fellowship, there was worship. So I think they went through a period of grief and loss, that we'd gotten to that point, but also the mighty movement of God's hand and God's spirit in the process. Because I think a lot of us thought that the building wouldn't sell, or that it would take years and years and years and years for the property to sell. And so how everything moved was almost, from a human perspective, it's like your mind couldn't catch up to it. And so I think that for them, it was a true testimony of God's faithfulness to the church and to this particular body of believers, and how God still, even though the size had changed, that God still had a mission for Grandview, and that they felt that we could sustain that and that we could make that transition. So, and we're still there. It will be 4 years this fall, and we still miss the building. We still miss having our own building and our own structure. There's days that we miss it a lot. I miss it a lot, and they miss it also. But so that's kind of what they went through after we began to move and sort through all of the stuff that had been collected for 8 decades, which is quite a bit of stuff. Even in a small, you'd be surprised how many nooks and crannies exist in a church building. And so a lot of it was because we knew we were going to be moving, we went through every single room for 3 months. That was a process. To remove all that stuff and decide what to keep and what to let go of. And so we had to come to a conclusion of what was important. Plus we had limited space. We were going to have one room and a chapel. It's a lot to whittle down to get to one room and a chapel after 80 years of being in a building. So that was kind of hard to let go of those things. And so, but for me, as I mentioned earlier, it was hard because, I think part of me was also kind of processing this reality that, when we're called to ministry, whatever capacity, I don't think we ever expect that God's going to call us to do such, I would say drastic, but that's the word that I have. It was pretty drastic to sell a church after 8 decades. So I think I was kind of in a fog for a little bit. And I was trying to help them through their grief. And also I was kind of sad because this was on my watch, right? This was during my tenure, and I'm still there, but this was during my tenure at Grandview. And so it's kind of like, when you go through an experience, you have to go with it through other people, but go through it yourself. And so that's been challenging also. But then again, same as their process was the deepening of my faith and reliance on God, right? I mean, to see God's movement in such profound and concrete ways was almost overwhelming, and in such a short time frame, and that even God was preparing this other ministry to buy the building. So I think that's what we've gone through. And I will say, and I probably you'll hear me say this over and over, I have to admire their bravery and their courageousness. It takes a lot of courage to let go of what has been for a lifetime. They were very brave and very courageous. And I'll share this a little bit later, but they made the decision they would rather stay together than keep the building. They would rather stay together as the body of Christ, because what stays us connected. And that's what they went through also. They had to define who they were and what was really important.
That's just really powerful to hear you speak about the congregation's experience, but then your own experience leading the congregation through that. It reminds me a little bit of some of the parallels that that we've been seeing pastors go through during COVID, of leading their congregations through this time of immense change and grief, while they are also experiencing this grief and this change at the same time. Which brings us a little bit into the next question, because out of this experience of selling your building, then there's this volatile experience, as we say in the Reshaping Church program, of COVID. And out of that, even in the midst of the pandemic, your congregation decided to engage in this Reshaping Church process through Central. So would you talk a little bit about, in your own words, about what the Reshaping Church process was like, and what it was like for Grandview to be involved in it at that point in your church's journey?
I think the reshaping process came along just at the time it was supposed to for us. Once we made the transition to our new location in the fall of 2018, we really began to try and discern what was next. Why did God preserve us, or why did God keep us going? And so we were really in a discernment process. And so, I'm often a believer that God is working. I mean, God is working always, but God is working ahead of us, right, and behind us. And, first of all, obviously the connection of being a Central alum, and then crossing paths, and all of these things coming together, and being able to participate in the first round of reshaping process. And so honestly, I think it was very, it was perfect timing. We were coming really into a season of really discerning what our mission and call was, now that we no longer were in the building that we knew. And so for me personally, I jumped at the chance when I saw that, because I knew that Grandview was ready. I knew that they were receptive. And also another nice thing about when you're involved in a church or an organization for a longer amount of time, as we all know, there's a level of trust. We couldn't have done this in my first few years of ministry at Grandview, the call, but we had developed such a trust with one another, between not only as believers in Jesus Christ, but also as pastor congregation. And so that had been developed over a decade. And so because of that reality, we could do this together. So we were just in the process of, well, what is it to be? And I kept telling them that we're at a rest stop. We've come to a rest stop, and this is going to probably sound a little, I wouldn't say harsh, but I told them God did not bring us here to die. And I told them that, and I tell them that. And so then this came along, and we really I feel that this was exactly what God wanted for us, to kind of define and look at our viability as a smaller congregation, but also, of course, then to face the pandemic in a different way, and to navigate that. So to be involved in the reshape process was really great timing. And we had a great coach. We had great support from both Central and also Pinnacle leadership associates. And so it was also a space to allow us to grieve what we had lost, not only from the pandemic, but also we had never really processed the loss of leaving the building. We just kind of moved and got settled. And so that was nice, to be able to really use that space, not only to grieve what we lost in the pandemic and that volatile situation, but also you probably can categorize selling a church building as a volatile event. And so I think that's what it was like. It was very good. It was a very good experience, a very timely experience. And one I think that the church is grateful that I'm grateful that we've been through, in terms of really putting words to our feelings, putting words to what we were experiencing. So it was perfect. It was such a great right on time experience for us in the reshaping process. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. There's of course, a lot of folks on this call who have been part of the Reshaping Church process or are part of it now. But just for others that might be watching later, part of the full congregational Reshaping Church process involves meeting with a coach and going through small groups where which really embodies a little bit of what Melissa was talking about earlier with giving everyone in the congregation a voice. The small groups are designed to do that and moving through this discernment process and developing a ministry plan. And so, Melissa, in the ministry plan that you and Grandview developed, part of what you talked about in there that really captured my attention was that which does not change, and how important that was in your process of reshaping church, to be grounded in that which does not change. So could you talk a little bit about that which does not change for Grandview in this journey and how you have been sustained through these volatile times?
Absolutely. I think the thing that really sustained Grandview through this, and the things that have not changed, was the DNA of Grandview in terms of their deep sense of relational fellowship. They're very good at, Grandview's very good at being together and doing things together. And so, and not only doing things together, but being actively involved in one another's lives. They deeply care for one another. They deeply care for their pastor, and I deeply care for them. So that was something that didn't change, both as we made the transition of selling the building and moving, but also through the pandemic. Also through these last 2 years of trying to figure out how to do church differently, especially in the first year of this. But that's one thing that didn't change, and one thing that I think that really sustained us through this transition. And I often will refer to it as the glue that held us together, in addition to the Holy Spirit. But also, and I mentioned, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but what kept them through this and has gotten Grandview through this was they really didn't want to disband. They wanted to stay together. And so that was one thing that did not change. We recognized that even though our space was different, even though we had some growing pains of sharing space, we were together. Even though our events were in a different location, a different time, we had to adjust schedules, whether it's Bible study or a women's brunch. We had to adapt, but we wanted to keep doing the things we'd been doing, and the fellowship and being involved in one another's lives, and also how adaptable that we are. That's been probably one of the greatest gifts that I've noticed. Quite often we had to make this, all of us had to make this unexpected shift when March of 2020 came. And understand something, one thing I didn't mention about the demographics of Grandview is I'm the youngest, and I'm about to be 48, and my oldest is 95. And so we have the ages in between of my older congregation. We made the transition to Facebook, and almost everybody came over. Everybody was already on Facebook. And so that was a gift, that we could, even when we were not physically together, that we could still be on Facebook. And even now we have a Zoom Bible study. So their adaptability is something that has not changed. And again, that being together, but also we recognize both through these two transitions, that God never changed. Like the God of yesterday is the God of today and the God of tomorrow. And of course reminds us in Scripture that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so that was really sustainability. And also our worship. Worship stayed the same, even though it was a little different when we were online. But we still worshiped, and prayer didn't change, Scripture didn't change. But so those are the things that didn't change. That which did not change for Grandview was the things that had gotten us through both transitions.
Thank you. That's really great. As you were talking about the adaptability of the congregation, I was thinking a little bit about one of the concepts, I guess, in reshaping church is kind of learning to exercise your adaptability muscles, and that as congregations do that, just like exercising, then you become stronger at doing that. And so it really seems like Grandview's experience of going through this process of selling the church building exercised this adaptability muscle that you all were then able to continue to use throughout the pandemic. So having been through this process of discernment and selling your church building and moving and then discerning what to do after that, what advice do you have for congregations who are considering selling their building?
That's a great question. I think there's several things. First of all, I think one of the things we learned is the words that we use, the semantics. For example, we switched from selling the church to selling the building. And I will never negate the reality that there are church buildings and we need structures. And having grown up in church, the church building to me was very important. It was almost a home away from home for me. One of the things we had to psychologically and emotionally make the switch to was we were selling the building. And we could even say we're selling the church building, but if we moved away from selling the church, it was a little easier. And then that really kind of opened up the conversation then as we know, the church is the body of Christ. And yes, we meet in a structure, whether it's a home, another building, or what is a sanctuary or a church building. That's one thing I think we have to pay attention to is the words that we use of how we approach that. Another thing I would suggest, if there's a conversation, and there should be conversations within the entire congregation about the process, about making this decision to sell the building, but also from a logistical standpoint, find a good realtor. Don't do this on your own. We sought out some, we asked questions, we asked other people who'd be a good realtor, especially for not-for-profits or ones who are used to selling larger structures. And so that's probably a really great piece of advice is find a good realtor because they know the legal contractual side of selling a building. So that'd be my piece of advice for that. And also, this is a chance to really demonstrate our, courage and bravery, as I mentioned, but also, if we can put it in the category of it kind of be exciting, it's kind of like an exciting anxiety, right? And so put this frame it as like an exciting opportunity, what God's going to do with this. But also, as I mentioned previously, to really have some honest conversations, because if we put this in a time frame for Grandview, it was a whole year from the time we were conversing to the time it actually sold and we moved to another structure. So have honest conversations, whether it's small groups, whether it's congregational conversations, but allow whatever size your congregation is, always allow everyone to have a voice. And I'll be completely honest, it wasn't 100% passed. The vote to sell, it was, and I don't know specific numbers, but it wasn't 100%, and that's okay. Not necessarily that it should be, but you really need to have those honest conversations. And also, if you have any kind of, a lot of our support also came from other sources. I talked about the region staff and whatnot. So we weren't in this by ourselves. That was the great thing is we were not alone in this. Whether that looks like, the congregation finding, someone to walk us through this, or the pastor, that this is not to be done in isolation, because it is a big deal. It still is a big deal for us. There's days that I will, admittedly, I will take a different route and drive by the old building, and just see it. It's kind of like driving by an old house or an old school or whatever that was familiar to you. So that would be some of my advice. And there's going to be shock, there's going to be grief in all of this, because these structures are so emotionally important to us. Understand that, understand that these structures have been a part of our lives for decades. And so don't negate that reality. But it will be challenging. It will be challenging, and there will be roadblocks, and there will be all kinds of emotions that are going to go all over the map. But then again, also, we spend a lot of time in discernment. in prayer, you know, and asking the Lord what we're supposed to be doing. You know, I remember a couple of times, even when I was by myself, and I had no idea where God was calling us and what God was calling us to do in the fall of 2017. So yeah, that would be my advice. There's I'm having flashbacks to those moments in signing contracts and actually moving. And one thing I also will tell you that we did, you know, I talked about cleaning out the building and throwing away things that we weren't going to take with us, but we also took things that were familiar to us, right? Like we took our communion table, we took pictures, we took our communion sets, we took things with us into this new land, and I love the phrase terra incognita. I love that phrase. But we took things that were familiar to us. You know, we took a podium, we took our offering plates, you know, so we took things that were familiar, so we weren't just going into a new space with nothing that was our own, you know, and I'm thinking of all the stuff that's in our storage room. There's a lot of stuff, and I even and here's a little insight. I even took my office chair from my office. It was comfortable, and so I took my office chair with me because I didn't want my office chair to stay there. So even my office chair made the transition, and we even took some of our chairs from Fellowship Hall, right? Some of our comfortable chairs from Fellowship Hall. So that'd be another piece of advice. If you can, take some of the familiar with you. Take that with you that's familiar. So that's another piece of advice. Don't leave everything behind, but take some of those things with you.
Those are incredibly helpful suggestions, both the practical ends of things, but then also the, I don't know, this taking familiar pieces into a new land sounds quite biblical too. So thank you for that reminder. We're going to open up here for questions and discussion in just a minute. But I do have one more question that I didn't send you in advance, Melissa, because I just thought of it. But so just a follow up real quick. So I asked about advice. You just answered advice for congregations who are considering selling their building. Could you also offer some advice for congregations who are part of the Reshaping Church process currently, and just based on your experience and your congregation's experience, what advice would you give churches who are part of that process right now?
A couple things. Remember that it is a journey. Remember that it's going to take unexpected turns, but also, and I think I was sharing this with somebody else, it's kind of like, you know, in the reshape process, if you compare it to like we have all GPS systems on our phones and our cars, whatever, it's kind of like we have the same system, but we start in a different place, we're going to end a different place, right? So our experience may be different than someone else's based on location and ministry and current things. So that's one thing I think that people need to remember is that even though we have the same tools, we're going to use them differently. You know, and another thing I want people that I'm, you know, in the reshape process is that, and I want to say this very carefully, but I don't think it's the responsibility of Pinnacle or Reshape to give us the answers as much as it has to help us to discover the answers, right? Because how and I see a couple of great coaches on here today. So how we were coached is going to be different than how somebody else is coached, and that's okay. It's not a coach's job to tell us what to do, right? It's, in my opinion, it is their job to help us to discover what's already there. So this is not a one size fits all process. This is not, you know, how Grandview went through it was different than the other churches that we were in community of practice with because they were different. You know, I'll give a quick example. One church had youth. We don't have youth, right? And so they could respond differently to the material than we could. And that's great. And I was excited for them that some of their youth wanted to be in a small group. That's awesome. You know, but we don't have that. If we had youth, that would be me by myself, right? I'm a little out of that category. But so that's one thing I hope that people going through the reshape process or going to go through this is that this is going to be your own journey. This is going to be a journey for your own situation. And again, this is not, we're gonna have a guidance system, but beginning and ending is going to be completely different. So that's what I would say is, if you're looking for the place to give you every single answer, then you probably would like to look someplace else. And I don't mean to be, I don't know what the word is, but this is a guide. This is a great place to just kind of navigate where you're called and how you're going to be reshaped after a volatile event.
That's incredibly, incredibly helpful. I love that idea of the reshape process as a guidance system, a tool, but that the journeys are very contextual.
Mhm.
So we'll go ahead and open it up now to other folks here, many people involved with Reshape in various kinds of ways. So questions, comments, and we'll start here with Ursula.
And Melissa, thanks for sharing it. And if you mentioned this, I apologize. I'm wondering what kind of, you talked about taking things with you, but I wonder if there were other rituals you had, like leave taking of the space as you left the building and went on this journey, if there was something you did in worship that kind of prepared you for that transition.
Ursula, I'm glad you asked that. The thought of it almost brought tears to my eyes, because I'll tell you, thank you for asking that. We did actually. Our last Sunday in the building was, let me think, 31st, 30th, 29th, 28th, October 28th of 2018. That was our last worship service at Grandview, the building. And then actually the church that bought the building came over and worshiped with us. And so, and ironically, and then we had, then after service, as it is with all good church gatherings, you have food, right? And so we had, we do fellowship, remember that. And so we had a reception after church. And then I remember very vividly, I was at the front of in the sanctuary in Grandview when I was finishing up preaching, and I was preaching and I was in it, and pretty soon the other people began to come in at the end of service. It was like the most divine timing ever. And I think about that and it still brings tears to my eyes, because here we were and we were making the transition. We were handing this off to this new group of people. And it was probably one of those most holy moments I've ever been a part of, was when we passed the mantle, right, to this congregation. So we worshiped for the last 10 minutes together. It was awesome. And then I had their pastor give the benediction. And so that was profound. It's still profound. And then we went down and we ate together. We broke brownies together, right? We didn't break bread together. We broke brownies together and cookies. And so we got to meet the people who were going to take over the ministry at the structure. So that still makes me cry. But then the next week, when we made the transition to the new space, I had a region staff, Joe Cutter. He's gone now, but he came and gave the message. And so, and then we had also a region staff come give a blessing at the closing, but maybe it was a year later. I don't remember, but I do remember we had a blessing on the space as we moved. So that was probably the greatest thing, Ursula, was that the congregation, the church that bought the building, we worshiped together for 10, 15 minutes, and it was phenomenal. It was great.
Thank you.
That's beautiful. Very sacred moment there. Other questions or comments for Melissa about selling the church building or the reshaping church process?
I just want to say thank you for saying how much language is important to how you approach things and how you're not selling the church. The church is the people, the church is that piece of it. So I very much appreciate that, because words do matter with how we say things and how we approach things.
Mm-hmm. And also, thank you, Carolyn, for observing that. And also, as it is in church life, especially if you're involved in a larger organization, when the word gets out, sometimes the pastor or the leaders have to not defend it, but redirect even the larger conversation. I remember someone came up to me in a different situation, and they said, "Oh, you're selling the church." And I said, "We're not selling the church. You can't sell the church, right? We're selling the building." So be prepared for that also. Be prepared for maybe some exterior unnerving conversations in other areas, because um, the reality is we're in a different time, and we know that, but knowing that and living that can be two different things, right? And so be prepared for that. There's another piece of advice. If you are in it and you're in the thick of it, be prepared for exterior nervousness. There's a great phrase, exterior nervousness. But you're right, words do matter. And that was a whole psychological shift that we were selling the building. That's, yeah.
Well, and I think it ties to what we've been talking about too with the pandemic and things going virtual, because we're not social distanced, we're physically distanced. You know, and I think that that's an important distinction too, because as you said, you have an older congregation who shifted to online space, which is fantastic. You know, so kudos for that as well, because yeah, again, words matter and how we approach things are good. But yeah, that's interesting phrasing. Thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, it was. And it was a big change, as was for all of us. And also in the DNA, specifically at Grandview, you know, to make the decision, we collectively decided to stop meeting together until it was over. Of course, we all thought it would be gone by Easter. You'll remember that. We thought by Easter it would be done. And then Easter we were online. But then of course, to make the decision to come back together safely. And again, we could meet more physical distance because we were smaller. In a space, we moved to Fellowship Hall because we shouldn't be in our chapel, you know, at the time. But yeah, they made I was very proud of them, and to make that kind of transition to hop online at their age. They were already on Facebook. And so, you know, when we were on it, and I had the majority of the congregation with me as we were virtual. So, you know, I'm kind of partial to them, but you know, but they're brave. They're brave.
I would add that you are too. To be leading a congregation through all of those volatile events takes tremendous courage and bravery. I'm wondering if I could call on Deborah, if that would be okay. I'd put her on the spot a little bit. Deborah was the coach for Melissa and Grandview Baptist Church through their Reshaping Church process. Deborah, would you have anything you'd like to add to this conversation?
It was a joy to journey with them, and it was the first offering of reshaping from Pinnacle. And so we were learning as we went. It clarified some things, particularly with Grandview. It clarified that this reshaping is a process, journey, to use Melissa's words, and not a program. And you are spot on. And we would say it ourselves. If you want somebody to tell you what to do and know where that destination is and have a 1, 2, 3, 4 platform, Pinnacle's and Central is probably not the place to get your help. But one thing I observed about Grandview in particular was they were most churches start as a small group and go, but they were defining church as the body of Christ, the people that were before them, and it was a sense of freedom, like, wow. So many churches today are struggling with debt, with trustees, with whatever comes with physical structures. And they had a sense of freedom. And it was just an honor to walk along with them. Melissa, it's good to see you today.
It's good to see you, Deborah. I saw you hopped on. I was hoping that you'd hop on.
Yeah.
It was, we had, yeah, I'm A+, Deborah. I know all the coaches are awesome, but I'm a little partial. But that was also good, I think, for myself, you know, because part of the Pinnacle process is also coaching for pastoral leaders and for leaders. And I think that's critical, because there was a space I could be honest and talk and kind of, you know, open the closet door and say, this is my closet, Deborah, what do I do with it, you know, kind of thing. You know, this process So that's another thing I think that I appreciated about the reshaping process was the coaching aspect for the leaders um, of that. And so yeah, it was a great experience. And now we have a friend out east, and so but that's great. And also another thing, Jessica, I think that's really great about the reshaping process is the communities of practice. We were connected with another American Baptist church in Indiana, yes, and then we had a church in Toledo that we were connected with also. And so that was nice to see different denominations, different traditions, and also different locations. So that's another advantage, I think, of the reshape process is that you get to see what's going on in other communities of practice and not just your own. So, but it was, you know, uh, but I will also kind of do a caveat here that the church and the leaders have to be ready for this. I know of churches that paused the process that weren't ready for that because other things were going on, and that's fine. But it's kind of like trying to force a square peg in a round hole, right? You can't do that. So churches really have to be in the right frame of mind to be in the reshape process. Otherwise, you just kind of sell yourself short as well as the entire opportunity. I will say that also.
Yeah, that's really helpful and echoes a lot of what we've found in working with churches through this process too. The importance of readiness and also I think speaks to, like we've talked about already, that Grandview had developed this muscle of adaptability, and that was part of why Grandview was ready for more adapting during this volatile event. I think
That's very,
yeah.
they were definitely poised. They were poised and prepared and probably didn't know Reshape did not exist when they sold the building. And so, but they were there was a readiness there that was very strong.
That's great. Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question or comment for Melissa before we wrap up for today. Does anyone else have anything to add or question to ask? Okay, well, I just want to take a moment then to say a huge thank you to Melissa for sharing your story and Grandview's story, not just with us today, but earlier in a discussion with Craig, which led to this article, which led to this lunch and learn. We're just trying to mine all of the lessons and wisdom that you and Grandview have for other congregations who have been or will be going through such decision-making processes and volatile events themselves. And so will you join me just in giving Melissa our thanks and appreciation for not only what she's done today, but also for her ministry with Grandview.
That's very kind. And before we depart, I see my friend Tracy. We journeyed Central together back in the day, back in the day.
Way back.
Way back, Tracy. But that's another thing I think that, and then I promise, stop talking. But I think that's another thing that's also what led not only me to Grandview, but also to this process was through Central, right? Through our seminary. So again, that was like 20 years ago, and so even that. So as churches look at this process, both whether it's selling the building or the reshape process, to understand that God is working like years and decades ahead of where you need to be before you get there, I think that's as critical in this conversation is the relationship we have with Central and then with Pinnacle and Reshape of how God really truly began to prepare the ground long before any of us showed up on the scene, right? So I wanted to give a shout out to my friend Tracy, and of those memories. But yeah, I think that's critical also to look at your history, to look where God has already been working, and your paths have yet to cross or continue to cross or whatever. I think that's important. That's important also in the whole process.
That's beautiful. That's a really helpful reminder of how God prepares our way through relationships, relationships rekindled sometimes. We appreciate that and appreciate all of you for being here today. For many of you for your work and participation with Reshaping Church and your connections to Central and or to Pinnacle in various ways. It was great to see many alums as well as current Reshaping Church participants joining us today. We have our Central Lunch and Learns every month on the third Thursday of the month at noon. And so we hope you'll mark your calendars and join us anytime. I'm still working on confirming our topic for May, so I don't have that for you now, but I know it will be good. We've got a couple options floating out there, and so I'll be excited to share that once that is confirmed. And working on the rest of the schedule for the summer and into the fall. And so we'll have some, I know we'll have some very engaging topics coming up for our Lunch and Learn. So anyone is welcome to join us any third Thursday at noon. And you can always find the information on our website on the events page about what the topics and speakers are, as well as the registration links. So again, I want to say thank you to Melissa. Thank you to Craig for his initial interview with Melissa that led to the article and then this discussion today. And thank you to each of you for being here and for the ministry that you do in your context. And as we leave now, I just wish you good health and safety and hope to see you again soon. Thank you all.